A poor teen was mocked for singing Tony Bennett's song. Tony Bennett reaction stopped the show. Few voices in American music carried the weight of an entire era quite like Tony Bennett. Born to Italian immigrant parents in New York City, Bennett rose from poverty and wartime service to become one of the most respected singers in the history of popular music. While the world remembers him for timeless classics like I Left My Heart in San Francisco, few truly know the challenges, quiet battles, and defining moments that shaped his extraordinary career. From smoky jazz clubs to the world's greatest stages, Tony Bennett's story is not just about fame, it is about resilience, dignity, and a voice that refused to fade with time. This is the true story behind the legend, a journey of talent, struggle, and timeless grace. The smell of fresh bread and poverty hung thick in the air of Astoria, Queens, where 13-year-old Anthony Dominic Benedetto learned that music wasn't just entertainment, it was oxygen. The cramped apartment above Benedetto's grocery store had become quieter since his father's death 3 years earlier, but young Tony's voice had only grown stronger, as if filling the silence his papa's laughter once occupied. "Tony, you're gonna wake the whole building!" His mother Anna called from the kitchen, where she was preparing another meal that would stretch just enough to feed her 3 children. Her voice carried the weight of exhaustion that had become her constant companion since becoming a widow at 35. But Tony couldn't stop. Standing in front of the cracked mirror in the hallway, he practiced the songs he'd heard on the radio, his voice trembling not from nerves, but from the raw emotion that seemed to pour out of him naturally. At 13, he already understood something that would take most people decades to learn. Music wasn't about perfection, it was about truth. The winter of 1943 was particularly brutal in Queens. While other kids complained about rationing and blackout drills, Tony had learned to find beauty in the struggle. When the neighborhood kids gathered around Old Man Rossetti's radio on Friday evenings, listening to the big bands broadcasting from Manhattan's glamorous nightclubs, Tony didn't just hear the music, he felt it in his bones, imagined himself on those stages, wearing a sharp suit instead of his hand-me-down clothes. "You sound like those singers on the radio," said Maria Castellano, the girl from apartment 3B, who sometimes lingered in the hallway when Tony practiced. She was 15, with dark eyes that seemed to understand more than most adults in the building. Tony blushed, his adolescent voice cracking slightly. "You really think so?" "I know so. My uncle plays at the Copacabana sometimes. He says real singers have something in their voice that can't be taught. You got that something, Tony." And his words planted a seed that would grow through decades of triumph and failure, through combat in Europe and comeback tours in America. But in that moment, they were simply the encouragement a poor kid needed to believe that his dreams weren't foolish. The grocery store downstairs had been the family's lifeline before his father's death, but now it was becoming their anchor to the bottom. Anna worked double shifts at a textile factory in Long Island City, while trying to keep the store afloat, leaving Tony to help his older brother John manage the day-to-day operations. The customers were mostly neighbors, immigrants like themselves, who understood that sometimes you paid when you could, not when you should. "Mrs. Kowalski needs her groceries on credit again," John said one afternoon, his 17-year-old face already showing the stress lines of someone forced to grow up too fast. "We can't keep doing this, Tony. We're going to lose everything." Tony looked at the elderly Polish woman waiting patiently by the counter, her thin frame wrapped in a wool coat that had seen better decades. He recognized the look in her eyes, the same pride mixed with desperation that he saw in his mother's face every morning. "Give her what she needs," Tony said quietly. "Papa always said people remember kindness longer than they remember debts." That evening, as Tony swept the store floor and prepared to close up, he found himself humming a melody that had been stuck in his head all day. It wasn't from the radio, it was something his father used to sing while arranging produce, an old Italian folk song about hope surviving hardship. The bell above the door chimed, and Father McKenna from St. Ritas entered, his Irish accent still thick after 30 years in America. "Young Anthony, I heard you singing from across the street. That voice of yours could wake the angels." "Thank you, Father. Just helping Mama close up." The priest studied him with the kind of look that suggested he was seeing more than just a teenager sweeping floors. "You know, we're putting together a choir for the Christmas service. Could use a voice like yours for the solos." Tony's heart leaped, but he kept his expression neutral. "I don't know much about church music, Father." "Music is music, son. The good Lord gave you that voice for a reason. Don't waste it on false modesty." That night, Tony lay in the bed he shared with his younger brother in their tiny room, staring at the ceiling and dreaming of stages beyond the church altar. Through the thin walls, he could hear his mother crying softly in the kitchen, the same muffled sobs that had become the soundtrack of their lives since his father's death. He made a silent promise that night, one that would drive him through decades of struggle and success. Someday he would sing not just to escape poverty, but to transform it. He would become the voice that reminded people that dignity could survive anything, that beauty could emerge from the most unlikely places. The next morning brought news that would change everything. John burst into the apartment waving a letter with an official government seal. "I got drafted," he announced, his voice trying to sound brave but betraying his fear. "Report to Fort Dix in 2 weeks." Anna Benedetto's face went pale. Losing her husband had been devastating. The thought of losing her eldest son to the war in Europe was almost unbearable. But Tony saw something different in this moment. Not just another loss, but an opportunity to step up, to become the man his family needed him to be. "I'll take care of everything, Mama," he said, his 13-year-old voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. "The store, the family, everything. And when John comes back, we'll be stronger than before." That afternoon, Tony performed his first real concert, a solo at Sunday Mass that had the entire congregation of St. Rita's turning in their pews to see where that powerful, mature voice was coming from. Father McKenna beamed with pride as Tony's rendition of Ave Maria filled the ancient church with a sound that seemed to transcend its humble Queen's setting. After the service, old Mrs. Romano grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Boy, I've been coming to this church for 40 years, and I never heard nothing like that. You got something special. Don't let nobody tell you different." Walking home through the December streets of Astoria, Tony felt something shift inside him. The poverty was still there, the uncertainty about his brother's safety, the weight of responsibility that no 13-year-old should carry. But alongside all of that was something new, the absolute certainty that his voice was not just a talent, but a responsibility. He would spend the rest of his life learning what that responsibility meant, how it would carry him through combat zones and recording studios, through periods of fame and obscurity, through personal demons and artistic resurrections. But it all began on that December afternoon in Queens, with a poor kid walking home from church, humming a melody that would eventually become his signature sound. The America of 1943 was a country at war, a nation where boys became men overnight and dreams were luxuries most couldn't afford. But Tony Benedetto understood something that would later make him Tony Bennett. In the darkest times, when survival seems impossible, sometimes the most radical act is to keep singing. The landing craft pitched violently in the choppy waters off the French coast as Private Anthony Benedetto gripped his rifle and tried to keep his breakfast down. Around him, dozens of other young Americans, most barely out of their teens, sat in grim silence, each lost in thoughts of home and the uncertainty that lay ahead on the beaches of Normandy. It was March 1945, and while the famous D-Day invasion had occurred the previous June, the war was far from over. Tony had been drafted on his 18th birthday, just as he'd started to make a name for himself singing in small clubs around Queens. The transition from performing Blue Moon at the Astoria Social Club to carrying an M1 Garand through the European countryside was jarring enough to shake any young man's sense of reality. "Hey, Brooklyn!" called out Sergeant Murphy, using the nickname he'd given Tony, despite his repeated corrections that he was from Queens. "You've been awful quiet. Usually can't shut you up." Tony managed a weak smile. Since basic training at Fort Dix, he'd become known for his ability to lighten the mood with impromptu performances. During the long ocean crossing aboard a crowded troop transport, his voice had provided comfort to homesick soldiers who gathered around him in the evenings, requesting songs that reminded them of sweethearts and Saturday night dances back home. "Just thinking about my family, Sarge. My brother John made it through the Pacific Theater last year. Hope I can do the same over here." "You will, son. Just keep your head down and remember your training." The reality of combat hit Tony during their first week in Germany. His unit, part of the 63rd Infantry Division, was tasked with liberating concentration camps and securing territory that the retreating German army had abandoned. Nothing, not the poverty of his childhood, not the death of his father, not any hardship he'd previously experienced, had prepared him for what he witnessed. At a liberated camp near Landsberg, Tony saw humanity at its lowest and highest points simultaneously. The skeletal survivors, barely alive after years of systematic brutality, somehow found the strength to weep with joy at the sight of American soldiers. That evening, sitting on his helmet beside a bombed-out church, Tony tried to process what he'd seen. "How do you make sense of something like that?" he asked Corporal Williams, a jazz pianist from Chicago who'd become his closest friend in the unit. "You don't make sense of it," Williams replied, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "You just carry it with you and try to be better because of it." That night, Tony sang for the first time since entering combat. Not the upbeat standards that had entertained his fellow soldiers during training, but something deeper, a wordless melody that seemed to come from a place beyond language, beyond explanation. Other soldiers gathered around him in the darkness, and for a few minutes the war felt distant. 2 weeks later, Tony's unit was advancing through a German village when they encountered a group of black American soldiers who had been separated from their unit and were being treated as second-class citizens by some of the white officers. The segregation that existed back home had followed the army into Europe, creating divisions even among men fighting the same enemy. Tony watched as a white lieutenant ordered the black soldiers to the back of a chow line, despite their having been in combat longer than many of the white troops. Something inside him, perhaps the memory of being looked down upon because of his immigrant background, or maybe just basic human decency, compelled him to act. "Excuse me, Lieutenant," Tony said, approaching the officer with the careful respect required by military protocol. "Those men have been fighting just as hard as any of us. Doesn't seem right to treat them different." The lieutenant's face reddened. "Private, you'd better check yourself. The army has its regulations." "Sir, I understand regulations, but I also understand right and wrong." The confrontation could have ended badly for Tony, but Sergeant Murphy intervened, diffusing the situation with the diplomatic skills that good non-commissioned officers develop. However, the incident marked Tony as someone willing to stand up for others, even when it wasn't comfortable or convenient. Later that evening, Corporal Williams approached Tony while he was cleaning his rifle. "Heard what you did today. That took guts. Just seemed like the right thing to do," Tony replied, not looking up from his weapon. "Most white boys wouldn't have said nothing. Means something that you did." That conversation began a friendship that would influence Tony's perspective on race, justice, and the power of music to bridge divides, insights that would shape his career and his character for decades to come. The war ended in May 1945, but Tony's service continued through the summer as part of the occupation forces. It was during this period, stationed in a small Bavarian town, that he experienced something that would profoundly impact his approach to music and performance. The town had been heavily bombed, its ancient church reduced to rubble, except for one wall that somehow remained standing. Local German civilians, many of them elderly or very young, gathered there each evening to sing traditional folk songs, not out of celebration, but from a desperate need to reconnect with something beautiful amid the destruction. Tony watched from a distance at first, struck by how music seemed to provide comfort even to people he'd been trained to see as enemies. One evening, an elderly German man approached him, speaking in broken English. "You are the American who sings, yes? My granddaughter, she heard you singing yesterday. She has not smiled since her parents died in the bombing, but when she heard your voice..." The old man's eyes filled with tears. "Music has no borders, young man. It speaks when words fail." That night, Tony made a decision that could have gotten him in serious trouble. He approached the group of German civilians and, after a moment of hesitation, began singing "Silent Night," first in English, then attempting the German lyrics he'd learned from the old man. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Men and women who had lost everything wept openly, not from sadness, but from recognition that humanity could still exist, even after the worst atrocities. A young German girl, perhaps 8 years old, smiled for the first time in months. Word of Tony's unauthorized fraternization reached his commanding officers, but instead of punishment, he found himself officially assigned to help with civilian relations. His music became a bridge between the occupying forces and the local population, demonstrating that healing could begin even in the most unlikely circumstances. "Bennett," Sergeant Murphy said one afternoon, "you got something special. Most soldiers just want to get home and forget this whole mess. But you're trying to fix something broken. That's rare. Music fixed me when I was broken, Sarge. Figure maybe it can help others too." As his service neared its end, Tony received a letter from home that changed everything. His mother wrote that a talent scout from a New York record company had heard about Anna Benedetto's singing son and wanted to meet him when he returned. The boy from Queens who had left for war as Anthony Benedetto would return as someone ready to become Tony Bennett. But first, he had one more performance to give. On his last night in Germany, Tony organized a concert in the ruins of that bombed church. American soldiers, German civilians, displaced persons from across Europe, all gathered together to hear a young man from Queens sing songs that reminded them of their shared humanity. As his voice echoed off the one remaining wall, carrying melodies that spoke of love, loss, hope, and resilience, Tony understood that music wasn't just his talent or his escape. It was his calling. He would spend the rest of his life using his voice, not just to entertain, but to heal, to bridge differences, and to remind people that dignity and beauty could survive anything. The war had taken his innocence, but given him purpose. The scared teenager who had boarded that landing craft had become a man who understood that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from lifting them up. This lesson would guide him through decades of success and failure, through changes in musical taste and personal struggles, and ultimately, the neon lights of Manhattan's theater district cast long shadows across the rain-soaked streets as Tony Bennett walked through Times Square, his demo recordings tucked safely inside his worn leather jacket. At 24, he carried himself with the cautious optimism of a man who had seen enough rejection to know that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford to waste, yet couldn't afford to abandon. The war had changed him. The boy who had once sung on street corners in Queens now possessed a gravity that came from witnessing death in European trenches, from carrying wounded soldiers to safety, from understanding that survival was never guaranteed. His voice had deepened, not just in timbre but in meaning. Each note now carried the weight of experience that no amount of vocal training could provide. "Next," called the receptionist at Columbia Records, her voice cutting through the chatter of nervous performers waiting their turn in the cramped lobby. Tony straightened his tie, a simple black one that his mother Anna had pressed for him that morning, her hand still trembling slightly from the arthritis that had worsened during his time overseas. "You remember what I told you?" she had said as he left their apartment that morning. "Don't let them change who you are. Your voice is your voice. Papa would have been proud." Ni, the receptionist, a woman in her 40s with carefully styled hair and red lipstick that had begun to fade, looked him up and down with the practiced indifference of someone who had seen 1,000 hopefuls walk through those doors. "Anthony Benedetto." "Yes, ma'am. Room 3B, you have 15 minutes. The recording booth was smaller than he had imagined, with soundproofing that made his breathing seem unnaturally loud. Behind the glass, 3 men in suits sat with expressions that revealed nothing. The one in the middle, slightly older with graying temples, motioned for him to begin. Tony closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of the makeshift stages he had performed on during the war, entertaining soldiers who needed to forget, if only for a few minutes, where they were and what they might face tomorrow. He thought of his father's voice, strong and steady despite their poverty, singing Italian folk songs while working in the grocery store. He thought of the streets of Queens, where music had been his escape from hunger, from loss, from the weight of dreams that seemed too big for a poor boy to carry. "I'll be singing Boulevard of Broken Dreams," he announced, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. The piano accompanist, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, began the opening notes. Tony opened his mouth and let his voice fill the small space, each word carefully chosen, each phrase shaped by years of hardship and hope. He wasn't just singing the lyrics. He was living them, breathing life into words that spoke of dreams deferred and hopes that refused to die. When he finished, the silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. The man with graying temples leaned forward, whispered something to his colleagues, then looked back at Tony. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" "The streets, sir, and from my father before he passed." "You have something," the executive said slowly. "But Anthony Benedetto is too ethnic for the current market. If we sign you, you'll need a stage name, something more American." Tony felt something twist in his chest. The name Anthony Benedetto carried his father's memory, his family's history, their journey from Italy to America in search of something better. It was the name his mother called out when she worried, the name written on his draft card, the name that connected him to everything he was. "What kind of name?" he asked quietly. "We're thinking Tony Bennett, clean, simple, American." It rolls off the tongue. Later that evening, Tony sat in a small diner near Penn Station, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The contract lay spread across the table, the words blurring together as exhaustion and uncertainty battled in his mind. The amount they were offering would change his family's life. His mother could stop taking in laundry, his brother could finish school, and they could move out of the cramped apartment where 4 people shared 2 rooms. But the price was his name, his identity. Rough Day. The voice belonged to a waitress, probably in her 50s, with kind eyes and the weathered hands of someone who had worked hard her entire life. "You could say that," Tony replied. "I've seen that look before," she said, refilling his cup without being asked. "My son, he had the same expression when he decided to join the army. Sometimes the choices that scare us most are the ones that save us." She walked away before Tony could respond, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the contract that would transform Anthony Benedetto into Tony Bennett. He thought about his father, dead these 14 years, but still present in every song Tony sang. He thought about the war, about the soldiers who had changed their names to fit in, to survive, to become something new while honoring what they had been. The signature came slowly, deliberately. Anthony Benedetto was not dying. He was evolving. Tony Bennett was being born not out of shame, but out of necessity, carrying within him everything Anthony had learned about music, about struggle, about the power of song to bridge the gap between who you are and who you need to become. 3 weeks later, Tony stood in his first professional recording session, his voice carrying across the studio with a confidence that surprised even him. The song was The Boulevard of Broken Dreams, the same one he had auditioned with, but now it carried additional weight. It was his first recording as Tony Bennett, a name that would soon become synonymous with American popular music. As the final notes faded, the producer gave him a thumbs up through the glass. Tony smiled, thinking of his mother listening to the radio at home, waiting to hear her son's voice reach beyond the streets of Queens for the first time. The boy who had sung for Nichols was gone, but his dreams, refined by hardship and strengthened by sacrifice, were just beginning. The Paramount Theatre's backstage area buzzed with the controlled chaos that preceded every major variety show. Tony Bennett adjusted his bow tie for the third time, watching from the wings as dancers rehearsed their routines and comedians ran through their timing. This was his biggest break yet, opening for the legendary Pearl Bailey, performing for an audience of 3,000 people who had never heard his name. 5 minutes, Bennett, called the stage manager, a harried man with a clipboard who seemed to exist in a perpetual state of barely contained panic. Tony's hands were steady, but his mind raced through the journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months since signing with Columbia Records, and already his life had transformed beyond recognition. The single Boulevard of Broken Dreams had begun receiving radio play, not just in New York, but across the country. Letters arrived daily from fans in places he had never imagined visiting. Small towns in Ohio, farming communities in Kansas, cities along the West Coast, where his voice had somehow found its way into living rooms and hearts. But success, he was learning, came with its own form of pressure. "You look nervous," said Pearl Bailey, appearing beside him in a stunning silver gown that caught the stage lights even in the dim backstage area. At 29, she was already a star, her voice and presence commanding respect from audiences and fellow performers alike. "A little," Tony admitted. There was no point in pretending otherwise with someone of her experience. "Good," she said with a smile that was both maternal and mischievous, "means you still care. The day you stop being nervous is the day you stop growing." Pearl had taken Tony under her wing during rehearsals, sharing insights about performing that no vocal coach could teach. She had watched him during his sound check, observing how he connected with the empty theater seats as if they were filled with close friends rather than strangers. "You have something special," she had told him after his first rehearsal. "But remember, they're not just listening to your voice, they're listening to your story. Make sure you're telling them one worth hearing." Now, as the orchestra played the opening notes of his first song, Tony walked onto the stage of the Paramount Theatre and into the brilliant wash of spotlights. The audience, a sea of faces stretching back into shadows, fell silent. This was the moment that would define whether Anthony Benedetto from Queens could truly become Tony Bennett of America. He began with "Because of You," a song that had quickly become his signature piece. But tonight, something was different. The lyrics, which he had sung dozens of times in smaller venues, took on new meaning in this grand space. Each word carried further, reached deeper, connected more intimately with the strangers who had paid to be entertained, but were receiving something more profound. In the third row, a middle-aged woman wiped tears from her eyes. Near the back, a young soldier on leave stood a little straighter. Throughout the theatre, 3,000 people found themselves drawn into Tony's world, a place where love and loss, hope and heartbreak were not just emotions but shared human experiences. When the song ended, the applause began as a rumble and built to a roar. Tony bowed, genuinely moved by the response, but also aware that this was just the beginning. He had 2 more songs to perform, and each one would either build on this success or reveal it as a fluke. "Thank you," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying the warmth and sincerity that would become his trademark. "This next song is dedicated to my mother, Anna, who taught me that dreams don't have to die just because they take longer than expected to come true." The orchestra began the introduction to Rags to Riches, and Tony felt something shift inside himself. This wasn't just a performance anymore. It was a conversation with 3,000 new friends, a sharing of his journey from the grocery store in Queens to this stage in Manhattan. Every note carried the weight of his father's early death, his mother's endless work to keep their family together, his own years of struggle and small victories that had led to this moment. Backstage after his set, Pearl Bailey waited with a glass of champagne and a smile that told him everything he needed to know before she spoke. That, she said, is how stars are born. Not with publicity campaigns or record company promotion, with moments like what just happened out there. The reviews in the next day's papers confirmed what Tony had felt on stage. The New York Times called his performance a masterclass in emotional honesty, while Variety proclaimed him a voice that bridges the gap between popular entertainment and genuine artistry. But the review that mattered most came in a phone call from his mother. "I heard you on the radio." Anna's voice crackled through the telephone line. "Mrs. DeMarco from downstairs, she was crying. She said your voice reminded her of her husband before the war. That's when I knew. You're not just singing songs anymore, you're singing people's lives." Within weeks, offers began pouring in. Television appearances, recording sessions, bookings at clubs across the country. Tony found himself riding trains to Chicago, flying to Los Angeles, performing in venues that had once existed only in his dreams. But with each success came the growing understanding that talent alone wasn't enough. The music industry was a business, and staying relevant required constant adaptation, endless promotion, and the ability to navigate relationships with executives who saw singers as products rather than artists. "You need to modernize," his new manager, Ray Muscarella, told him during a meeting at the Columbia Records offices. "Rock and roll is changing everything. Kids don't want crooners anymore. They want energy, rebellion, something that speaks to their generation." Tony listened politely, but felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had found his voice by staying true to the music that moved him, by honoring the traditions of American popular song while bringing his own experiences to bear on classic melodies. The suggestion that he abandoned this approach felt like betrayal, not just of his artistic integrity, but of the audiences who had embraced him precisely because he offered something timeless in an increasingly frantic world. "I appreciate the advice," Tony replied carefully, "but I think there's value in doing what I do well, rather than trying to become something I'm not." The meeting ended with polite smiles and handshakes. But Tony left, knowing that his refusal to compromise would eventually create problems. The music industry rewarded adaptability, and artists who insisted on artistic integrity often found themselves relegated to smaller venues, forgotten by radio programmers chasing the next big sound. That evening, sitting in his new apartment, still modest but a significant upgrade from Queens, Tony reflected on the strange nature of success. He was earning more money than his family had ever seen, his name was becoming known across the country, and his dreams were coming true in ways that exceeded even his most optimistic fantasies. Yet he felt the weight of choices approaching, decisions that would determine whether Tony Bennett would be remembered as a flash of brilliance or a lasting voice in American music. The easy path was clear: adapt to trends, follow market research, become whoever the industry needed him to be. The harder path, staying true to his artistic vision while navigating commercial pressures, offered no guarantees except the satisfaction of authenticity. Outside his window, the lights of Manhattan twinkled like stars, each one representing dreams and ambitions, successes and failures, the endless cycle of hope that drew people to cities where anything seemed possible. Tony Bennett was no longer the poor boy from Queens singing for nickels, but he carried that boy's dreams with him, protective of the music that had saved him and determined to honor it, regardless of what the future might demand. The desert heat pressed against the windows of Tony Bennett's suite at the Sands Hotel, but inside, the air conditioning hummed with mechanical indifference to the crisis unfolding in his career. At 42, Tony sat at a mahogany desk, scattered with contracts he no longer wanted to sign, reviews that stung with dismissive cruelty, and financial statements that painted a picture of an empire slowly crumbling. "Rock and roll isn't going away, Tony," his manager Ray Muscarella said, pacing across the plush carpet with the restless energy of a man watching his commission checks shrink. "The Beatles changed everything. The Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, that's what kids want to hear. We need to adapt or we're finished." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Tony could see the Las Vegas Strip stretching into the distance, a monument to reinvention and the pursuit of relevance at any cost. He had been performing here regularly for 3 years, watching his audiences grow older and smaller, while younger acts filled the larger venues with screaming teenagers who had never heard of the Great American Songbook. "I tried adapting," Tony replied quietly, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had spent the better part of a decade fighting a battle he seemed destined to lose. "Remember Tony Sings the Great Hits of Today, the album where I covered Eleanor Rigby and A Hard Day's Night?" Ray winced at the memory. The album had been Columbia Records' attempt to modernize Tony Bennett, pairing his traditional vocal style with contemporary rock arrangements. The result had pleased neither his longtime fans, who felt the marble floors of Columbia Records' executive suite echoed with the sharp click of expensive leather shoes as Tony Bennett walked through the corridors that had become as familiar as his own apartment. 12 years had passed since that desperate night in Times Square when he'd considered giving up music entirely. Now, gold records lined the walls bearing his name, and secretaries nodded respectfully as he passed. The transformation seemed complete, yet something gnawed at him with increasing intensity. Mitch Miller's office commanded a view of Manhattan that spoke of power and influence. The man behind the desk had been both Bennett's savior and his creative tormentor, the executive who'd lifted him from obscurity while simultaneously pushing him toward commercial compromises that left Bennett feeling hollow. Today's meeting would determine the direction of his next album, and Tony could already sense the familiar tension building. "Tony, sit down," Miller said without looking up from the sales reports scattered across his mahogany desk. "We need to talk about your future here." Bennett settled into the leather chair, his hands unconsciously smoothing the fabric of his tailored suit. Success had afforded him the finest clothes, but he still remembered the weight of his father's patched work shirts, the careful mending his mother had done by lamplight to make their few possessions last. Those memories never left him, especially during moments like this, when the distance between who he'd been and who he'd become felt vast. "The numbers on your last album were disappointing," Miller continued, finally meeting Bennett's eyes. "Don't get me wrong. I Left My Heart in San Francisco was brilliant, a career-defining moment, but that was 2 years ago, and the industry is changing faster than we anticipated." Through the office window, Bennett could see the bustling streets of Midtown Manhattan. Somewhere down there, he knew, were young singers like he'd once been, carrying their dreams and their desperation in equal measure. The thought stirred something protective in him, a recognition of the vulnerability that success had temporarily masked, but never truly erased. "The kids today want something different," Miller was saying. "Rock and roll isn't going away, Tony. It's getting stronger. The Beatles, Bob Dylan, they're speaking to a generation that doesn't care about the Great American Songbook. We need to adapt or risk becoming irrelevant." Bennett shifted forward, his jaw tightening. "Irrelevant? Mitch, we're talking about songs that have survived decades because they speak to something eternal in people, body and soul. The Way You Look Tonight. These aren't just songs. They're American cultural heritage. Cultural heritage doesn't sell records to 17-year-olds, Miller replied, his tone growing sharper. And 17-year-olds are who buy records now. Their parents might appreciate your artistry, but they're not the market anymore." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Bennett finding himself defending not just his artistic choices, but his entire philosophy of music. He spoke passionately about the craftsmanship of songwriters like Cole Porter and George Gershwin, about the importance of proper vocal technique and emotional authenticity. Miller listened with the patience of a man who'd heard these arguments before and found them increasingly antiquated. As Bennett left the Columbia building that afternoon, the autumn air carried the first hint of winter. He walked slowly through Central Park, his mind churning with the implications of their discussion. The success he'd fought so hard to achieve now felt precarious, dependent on his willingness to abandon the very principles that had made that success meaningful. Near the park's eastern edge, he encountered a small crowd gathered around a street performer, a young man with a guitar who was singing a Beatles song with obvious passion but limited skill. The audience was engaged, some singing along, others dropping coins into the open guitar case. Bennett watched, struck by the simplicity of the exchange. Music offered, music received, connection made. That evening, at his apartment overlooking the Hudson River, Bennett sat at his piano and played through some of his favorite standards. Each song carried memories. The first time he'd heard Billie Holiday sing "Strange Fruit," the night Frank Sinatra had complimented his phrasing. The moment he'd understood that singing wasn't just about technique, but about finding the story within each song and making it his own. His reflection was interrupted by a phone call from his booking agent, Jerry Weintraub, whose voice carried its usual mixture of enthusiasm and concern. "Tony, we need to talk about your touring schedule. Some of the venues are expressing concerns about your draw with younger audiences." "What kind of concerns?" Bennett asked, though he suspected he already knew. "The Flamingo in Vegas wants to know if you'd consider adding some contemporary material to your set. Maybe a Beatles cover, something that shows you're keeping up with the times. And the college bookings, they're getting harder to secure. The kids want rock bands, folk singers, anyone but traditional pop crooners." Bennett closed his eyes, feeling the weight of an industry in transition. He thought about his mother, Anna, who had sacrificed so much to give him opportunities she'd never had. She'd worked multiple jobs, gone without necessities, all so her son could chase his musical dreams. The success he'd achieved was as much hers as his, a vindication of her faith and sacrifice, but that success now seemed to require a betrayal of everything she'd taught him about integrity and staying true to one's values. Anna Benedetto had never compromised her principles, even when poverty made compromise tempting. She'd raised him to believe that some things were more important than financial security or popular approval. "Jerry," Bennett said finally, "I need some time to think about all this. Can we postpone any major decisions until after the holidays?" "Sure, Tony, but don't think too long. The industry isn't going to wait for us to figure things out." After hanging up, Bennett poured himself a glass of wine and stood by his window, looking out at the city that had given him everything he'd dreamed of and was now threatening to take it all away. The lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly in all directions, each one representing someone with their own struggles and aspirations. He thought about the teenager he'd been, performing in Queens clubs for audiences who often weren't really listening, driven by a belief that music could transcend circumstances and connect people across all barriers of class, age, and background. That belief had sustained him through poverty, war, and the grinding uncertainty of building a career from nothing. Now, at the height of his success, that same belief was being tested in ways he'd never anticipated. The question wasn't whether he could adapt to changing times. He was certain he could learn new songs, adjust his style if necessary. The question was whether such adaptations would preserve or destroy the essence of what made his music meaningful. As the night deepened, Bennett made his way to his study, where shelves lined with books on music theory and vocal technique shared space with recordings of the artists who'd inspired him. He pulled out an album by Nat King Cole, one of his heroes, and listened to the elegant simplicity of Cole's approach to a standard ballad. The music filled the room with warmth and sophistication, reminding Bennett why he'd fallen in love with this art form in the first place. It wasn't just entertainment, it was communication at its most profound level, the ability to touch something universal in the human experience through melody, rhythm, and carefully chosen words. Tomorrow would bring new pressures, new demands to compromise or risk obsolescence. But tonight, in the quiet of his apartment with Nat King Cole's voice providing a soundtrack, Bennett felt connected to something larger than market forces or industry trends. He felt connected to the continuing story of American music, a story in which he'd played a significant part and hoped to continue playing, regardless of what adaptation might require. The city below continued its restless movement, unaware that in one apartment overlooking the Hudson, a successful artist was wrestling with questions that would ultimately define not just his career, but his character. The Motown sound had begun to reshape American music from a converted house on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit, and Tony Bennett found himself in the Motor City for a 3-night engagement at the prestigious Book Cadillac Hotel. The contrast couldn't have been starker. While Berry Gordy Jr. was revolutionizing popular music just miles away with acts like the Supremes and the Temptations, Bennett was performing for largely white, affluent audiences who still appreciated the sophistication of traditional pop. On his second evening in Detroit, after a successful show to a packed ballroom, Bennett decided to explore the city rather than retire immediately to his hotel suite. His driver, a local man named James Washington, offered to show him around the neighborhoods that tourists rarely saw, areas where the real pulse of Detroit could be felt. "Mr. Bennett," James said, as they drove through the east side, "most entertainers who come through here never see anything beyond downtown and the nice hotels. But this city has music in its bones, not just the Motown stuff everyone talks about, but church music, blues, jazz, real music from real people." They stopped at a small club called the Blue Note, tucked between a barber shop and a corner grocery store. The venue was nothing like the elegant ballrooms where Bennett typically performed. Wooden floors worn smooth by decades of dancing, tables scarred by cigarettes and spilled drinks, and a small stage that looked like it had been built by the owner's cousin. Yet the moment Bennett stepped inside, he could feel the authenticity that had been missing from too many of his recent performances. A young singer named Marcus Johnson was on stage, backed by a simple trio, piano, bass, and drums. He was performing "The Way You Look Tonight," one of Bennett's signature songs, but his interpretation was entirely his own. Johnson's voice carried a rawness and emotional vulnerability that reminded Bennett of his own early performances, when every song felt like a desperate attempt to communicate something essential about the human experience. The audience at the Blue Note was unlike any Bennett had encountered in recent years. Working-class people of all ages and races, united by their love of good music and their appreciation for honest artistry. They listened intently, responded vocally to particularly moving passages, and created an atmosphere of shared experience that Bennett realized he'd been missing in his more upscale venues. During a break between sets, Johnson approached Bennett's table, his eyes wide with recognition and nervous excitement. "Mr. Bennett, I can't believe you're here. Your recording of 'Because of You' changed my life. I was 16, working in my father's garage, when I heard it on the radio. That's when I knew I wanted to sing professionally." Bennett felt a familiar warmth, the connection between generations of artists that transcended race, class, and circumstance. "Your interpretation of 'The Way You Look Tonight' was beautiful," he replied. "You found something in that song I hadn't heard before. That's the mark of a true artist." They talked for nearly an hour, with Johnson sharing his struggles to find opportunities in a music industry that was rapidly segregating into distinct markets. "I love the classic songs," Johnson explained, "but the record companies tell me that black artists should stick to R&B or soul music. They say there's no market for a black singer doing Gershwin or Cole Porter." Bennett recognized the frustration in the young man's voice, remembering his own battles with record executives who wanted to push him in commercial directions that felt false to his artistic vision. But Johnson faced additional barriers that Bennett had never encountered. Racial prejudice that limited where he could perform and what type of music he was allowed to pursue. "The songs don't belong to any one race or class," Bennett said firmly. "Great music is universal. Your voice, your interpretation, that's what matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As the evening progressed, Johnson invited Bennett to join him for an impromptu performance. The moment felt charged with possibility as Bennett stepped onto the small stage, facing an audience that had no expectations beyond hoping for good music. He chose "I've Got the World on a String," and as he began to sing, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: complete artistic freedom. The audience at the Blue Note responded with enthusiasm that felt genuine and unforced. They weren't applauding because they were supposed to, or because his name was on the marquee. They were responding to the music itself, to the emotional truth of the performance. When Johnson joined him for a duet on "They Can't Take That Away From Me," the blend of their voices created something magical, a bridge between different musical traditions and generations. After the performance, as Bennett prepared to leave, an elderly woman approached him. Her name was Dorothy Williams, and she had been coming to the Blue Note for 30 years, since shortly after moving north from Alabama during the Great Migration. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice carrying the weight of lived experience, "what you did tonight, singing with Marcus, treating him like the artist he is, that means more than you know. Music should bring people together, not separate them." The drive back to his hotel was quiet, both Bennett and James lost in their own thoughts. Finally, James broke the silence. "You know, Mr. Bennett, what happened tonight? That's the kind of thing that could make a real difference. There's a lot of talented people in this city who never get the chances they deserve." Bennett stared out at the Detroit skyline, thinking about the evening's events and their broader implications. The music industry was changing rapidly, but not just in terms of style and commercial trends. The civil rights movement was challenging every aspect of American society, including the entertainment world's traditional segregation and limitations. Over the next few days, Bennett found himself returning to the Blue Note, drawn by the authenticity of the music and the genuine connections he was making with both artists and audiences. He began to understand that his own artistic crisis, the pressure to adapt to changing commercial demands, was part of a much larger transformation happening in American culture. On his final night in Detroit, Johnson approached him with an unusual request. "Mr. Bennett, I know this might sound crazy, but I've written a song. It's about the struggle to keep authentic music alive in a world that seems to value flash over substance. Would you mind listening to it?" The song was called "Song for Tomorrow." And as Johnson performed it, accompanied only by piano, Bennett heard echoes of his own concerns about the direction of popular music. The lyrics spoke of artists who refused to compromise their vision despite commercial pressures, of the responsibility each generation had to preserve the best of what came before while creating something new and meaningful. "Marcus," Bennett said when the song ended, "that's not just a good song, it's an important one. It says something that needs to be said." As his plane lifted off from Detroit the next morning, Bennett carried with him more than just memories of good performances. He carried a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of his role as an artist. The young singers he'd met, like Marcus Johnson, were facing challenges that made his own commercial pressures seem manageable by comparison. Yet they continued to pursue their art with integrity and passion. The experience in Detroit had reminded Bennett that great music wasn't just about individual success or commercial viability. It was about creating connections between people, preserving cultural traditions while remaining open to growth and change, and using whatever platform one had to support and encourage other artists. Back in New York, as Bennett returned to his routine of recording sessions and booking meetings, he carried with him the sounds and voices of the Blue Note. The memory of that small club, with its worn floors and genuine audience, would influence decisions he made in the coming months. Decisions that the desert wind carried the scent of defeat through the half-empty parking lot of Caesar's Palace as Tony Bennett sat in the back of a taxi, staring at the neon pyramid that promised fortunes but delivered mostly broken dreams. The cabbie, a weathered man with nicotine-stained fingers, glanced in the rearview mirror at his passenger. "Are you sure this is where you want to go, buddy?" the driver asked, his voice carrying the skeptical tone of someone who'd seen too many people chase impossible odds in this city. The lounge entrance is around back, but if you're looking for the big showroom... The lounge is fine, Tony replied quietly, his voice carrying none of the confidence that had once commanded the attention of packed houses at the Copa. The words felt strange in his mouth, like admitting to a crime he never meant to commit. As the taxi pulled away, Tony stood alone under the flickering neon sign that advertised live entertainment nightly, in letters that had seen better decades. The entrance to Caesar's Palace Lounge looked nothing like the grand theatres where he'd once performed, nothing like the recording studios where he'd crafted songs that defined an era. This was where careers came to die slowly, where legends learned to accept smaller stages and smaller dreams. Inside, the lounge was a study in faded glamour. Red velvet booths showed their age under dim lighting, and the small stage looked like an afterthought squeezed between the bar and a row of slot machines that chimed with mechanical optimism. The audience consisted mainly of tourists killing time between gambling sessions and locals who nursed drinks that lasted all evening. Frank Castellano, Tony's manager since the lean years began, waited at a corner table with 2 glasses of whiskey and a forced smile that didn't quite hide his own desperation. "Tony, there you are," he said, standing to embrace his client with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for funerals. The room's starting to fill up. Well, relatively speaking. Tony counted maybe 30 people scattered across tables that could seat 100. A young couple near the stage whispered to each other and kept checking their watches. An elderly man at the bar had fallen asleep over his scotch. 3 women in their 50s, tourists from Ohio by the sound of their accents, seemed genuinely excited to see him perform. "This is it then," Tony said, settling into the booth across from Frank. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a familiar burn, one that had become his companion during these difficult years. Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Look, I know this isn't Madison Square Garden, but it's steady work. 3 shows a week for 6 months, and they're paying us decent money. In this market, for traditional pop music, this is about as good as it gets." The words hit Tony like physical blows. Traditional pop music. As if the songs that had moved millions of people were now museum pieces, curiosities for a generation that preferred disco beats and synthesized sounds. He thought about the recording sessions he'd walked away from, the producers who wanted him to add drum machines and electric guitars to songs that had been perfect in their original form. "You remember when we played the Copa?" Tony asked suddenly, his eyes distant. "Standing room only every night for 3 weeks. The Times critic called it a masterclass in American vocal artistry. Now look at us." Frank's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "The music business changed, Tony. It's not about what we want anymore. Rock and roll took over, then disco. Now there's this new wave stuff. The kids don't want to hear Gershwin and Porter. They want loud guitars and lyrics about rebellion. So we give up." Tony's voice carried an edge of defiance that surprised even him. "We pretend that 40 years of craft means nothing because some executive in a suit decides that real music is old-fashioned." Before Frank could answer, the lounge manager, a thin man named Eddie Rourke, with slicked-back hair and a perpetually nervous expression, approached their table. "Mr. Bennett, we're ready for you whenever you are. The piano's been tuned, and I made sure the sound system is working properly." Tony looked around the room one more time. The crowd had grown slightly, maybe 40 people now, but the atmosphere remained subdued. These weren't fans who had bought tickets months in advance. They were people who had wandered in looking for background music while they drank. As he walked toward the small stage, Tony caught fragments of conversation from the tables. "Is that really Tony Bennett?" one woman asked her companion. "I thought he was dead," came the reply. A businessman at the bar was explaining to his colleague that Bennett used to be famous back in the day, as if that day were centuries ago rather than just a few years past. The piano player, A session musician named Bobby Watts, who worked the Vegas lounges circuit, gave Tony an encouraging nod. Bobby was good, professional, but Tony missed the intuitive connection he'd once shared with accompanists who knew his every musical breath, who could anticipate his phrasing before he'd even decided on it himself. "Good evening," Tony said into the microphone, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a performer who understood that every audience, regardless of size, deserved his best effort. "Thank you for being here tonight." The response was polite applause, the kind reserved for opening acts. Tony felt the familiar flutter of nerves that had never entirely left him, even after thousands of performances. But tonight, the nerves carried a different weight. This wasn't pre-show excitement. It was the anxiety of a man who wondered if anyone still wanted to hear what he had to say. He started with "The Way You Look Tonight," a song that had never failed him, a melody so perfect and lyrics so true that they seemed to exist outside of fashion or trend. His voice, despite the years of struggle and disappointment, remained strong and precise, each note placed with the care of a craftsman who understood his instrument. But something was wrong. The audience was polite, but distracted. Conversations continued at several tables. The businessman at the bar was reading a newspaper. Even the women from Ohio, his most enthusiastic supporters, seemed to be waiting for something more energetic, more contemporary. Tony pushed through his set list, each song a testament to an era that seemed to be slipping away despite his efforts to preserve it. "I Left My Heart" in San Francisco got the best response, probably because it was the only song some people in the room recognized. When he finished, the applause was warm but brief, the kind that said, "Thank you for your service," rather than, "Please don't stop." Back at the table with Frank, Tony stared at his untouched second whiskey, while the lounge filled with recorded music that bore no resemblance to what he'd just performed. "Honest assessment," he said finally. "What did you think?" Frank chose his words carefully. "Your voice sounded great, Tony, really great. It's just—" He gestured helplessly at the room around them. "This isn't your audience. These people came here to gamble and drink, and maybe hear some background music. They don't understand what they just witnessed. So where is my audience?" Tony asked, the question carrying all the weight of a career that seemed to be evaporating. Did they die? Did they forget? Or did I somehow fail them? The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable and devastating. Outside, Las Vegas continued its eternal performance, promising dreams to anyone with enough money to buy a ticket. But inside the lounge, Tony Bennett sat with the growing realization that the world he'd known, the world that had made him who he was, might be disappearing forever. Later that night, alone in his hotel room overlooking the Strip, Tony sat at the window, watching the lights that never dimmed. Somewhere out there were young musicians, probably dreaming of fame and fortune, just as he once had. But what would they find when they got there? Would they discover the same joy in craft and artistry that had sustained him through the best years of his career? Or would they learn to compromise until their art became indistinguishable from commerce? He thought about his father, who had died when music was still something that brought families together around pianos in living rooms, when songs lasted for generations instead of weeks. What would the old man think of his son now, playing to half-empty lounges in cities built on illusion? The questions followed Tony into an uneasy sleep, where he dreamed of concert halls filled with people who understood that some things, craft, authenticity, the careful cultivation of beauty, were worth preserving even when the world seemed determined to forget them. The cramped recording studio in Midtown Manhattan felt like a confession booth, where Tony Bennett had come to examine his artistic soul. Unlike the spacious, luxurious facilities where he'd once recorded his biggest hits, this place was utilitarian, honest in its simplicity. The walls were bare except for soundproofing foam, and the mixing board looked like it had survived several decades of New York's music scene. Danny Bennett, Tony's son, stood behind the glass partition with Ralph Sharon, the pianist who had become Tony's closest musical collaborator, and in many ways, his salvation. At 33, Danny possessed his father's intensity, but channeled it through the calculating mind of someone who understood both art and business. He'd spent the last 3 years slowly, carefully rebuilding his father's career from the ground up. "Let's try the good life again, Dad." Danny's voice came through the studio monitors with gentle authority. "This time, don't think about what the market wants. Don't think about radio play or demographic appeal. Just sing it the way you feel it." Tony stood at the microphone, his hands slightly trembling, not from nerves, but from the caffeine he'd been consuming to fuel these long recording sessions. At 60, he was attempting something that conventional wisdom declared impossible. A comeback based purely on artistic integrity, with no concessions to contemporary trends. "You know," Tony said, pulling off his headphones temporarily, "there was a time when I would have killed for advice about market appeal. Now my son is telling me to ignore it completely." Ralph Sharon smiled from behind his piano. The veteran accompanist had worked with Tony through the peak years and had chosen to stay loyal through the wilderness period. "Maybe that's the whole point, Tony. Maybe the market was never the real audience anyway." They'd been working on this album for 6 months, choosing songs that represented not compromise, but pure artistic vision, standards that had been tested by time, melodies that revealed new depths with each interpretation. Tony insisted on recording live with the band, no overdubs, no studio trickery, just the immediate, honest communication between musicians that had been the foundation of all great jazz and popular music. "Tell me about the Columbia meeting again," Tony asked his son as they took a break. He'd heard the story 3 times, but it still seemed too good to be true. Danny pulled up a chair next to his father. "Don Iena called me personally. He's the new president at Columbia, and he's looking to rebuild their catalogue with what he calls heritage artists. But here's the interesting part. He doesn't want you to change your sound. He wants you to go deeper into it." The irony wasn't lost on Tony. Columbia Records, the same label that had dropped him 8 years earlier when his sales declined, was now courting him again. But the music industry had evolved in unexpected ways. Compact discs were creating new markets for catalog material, and suddenly there was renewed interest in what marketing departments called classic American music. "What's the catch?" Tony asked, because he'd learned that in the music business there was always a catch. "No catch," Danny replied. "Well, except that they want to start small, build the audience organically. They're talking about targeting jazz festivals, smaller venues, building word-of-mouth support. It's the opposite of the blockbuster approach." Ralph Sharon finished tuning his piano and called out from across the studio. "Sounds like they want to treat you like a jazz musician instead of a pop star." "Maybe that's what I always was," Tony mused. "Maybe I just got confused for a while about the difference." The realization had been building slowly over the past several years, as Tony performed in smaller venues and rediscovered the intimate connection between performer and audience that had been lost in the grand theaters and television studios of his peak fame period. In jazz clubs and college auditoriums, he'd found people who listened to lyrics, who appreciated the space between notes, who understood that entertainment could be art without apologizing for it. That afternoon, they recorded "Fly Me to the Moon," a song Tony had performed thousands of times, but was approaching now with fresh perspective. Instead of the swinging, up-tempo version that had become standard, he chose a more contemplative arrangement, allowing the lyrics to breathe and the melody to reveal its underlying sophistication. "That's it," Danny said through the monitor when they finished the take. "That's the sound. Dad, you just recorded the definitive version of that song." And Tony wasn't sure about definitive, but he knew he'd sung it honestly, without trying to be anything other than exactly who he was at this moment in his life. The voice was older, carrying more weight and experience, but also more clarity about what mattered and what didn't. During the lunch break, they walked through Times Square, which was undergoing its own transformation. The seedy decay of the 1970s was giving way to corporate renovation, but the energy remained unmistakably New York. Street musicians played everything from hip-hop to classical, and Tony found himself listening to all of it with curiosity rather than judgment. "You hear that kid on the saxophone?" Tony pointed to a young man playing Charlie Parker phrases with remarkable skill. "He's got something real, technique plus feeling. That's what you can't teach." Danny followed his father's gaze. "Think he's making a living?" "Probably not," Tony admitted. "But he's keeping the music alive. That matters more than we realize." They stopped at a deli where Tony had been eating since his struggling days in the 1950s. The owner, an elderly Italian man named Sal Benedetto, recognized Tony immediately, despite the years that had passed since his last visit. "Tony Bennett!" Sal exclaimed, embracing him warmly. "Where you been, paisan? You disappeared for a while. We thought maybe you forgot about us little people." "Never, Sal," Tony replied, genuinely moved by the recognition. "Just had to figure some things out." As they sat at a small table with sandwiches and coffee, Sal regaled them with stories about the neighborhood's changes, the businesses that had closed, the families that had moved away. But he also talked about continuity, the traditions that persisted, the values that survived despite all the surface changes. "You know what I tell my grandson," Sal said, pointing to a young man working behind the counter. "I tell him, don't chase what's popular. Do what you do better than anybody else, and eventually people find you. Maybe take time, but they find you." Walking back to the studio, Tony felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine optimism about the future. Not the desperate hope that had sustained him through the lean years, but actual confidence based on a clear vision of what he wanted to accomplish. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Bennett's Upper East Side apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors where sheet music lay scattered like fallen leaves. Tony sat at his piano, his fingers dancing across the keys with the same precision that had carried him through decades of performance. But something was different now. The notes seemed to carry more weight, each chord progression a deliberate choice rather than muscle memory. At 69, Tony Bennett was experiencing something he hadn't felt in years: genuine excitement about his career. The phone call from his new manager, Danny Bennett, his own son, still echoed in his mind from the previous evening. "Dad, we're going to do this differently. We're going back to what made you great in the first place." The irony wasn't lost on him. After years of trying to chase trends, of recording disco albums and contemporary pop songs that felt foreign on his tongue, salvation was coming through a return to his roots. The Great American Songbook, those timeless standards he'd been told were outdated and irrelevant, was suddenly finding new life among younger audiences who craved authenticity in an increasingly artificial world. Tony's fingers found the opening notes of "The Way You Look Tonight," and he began to sing softly, his voice carrying the weathered beauty of someone who had lived every word he sang. The apartment filled with the familiar melody, but there was something else there too, a sense of purpose that had been missing during those dark years in Las Vegas and Los Angeles. The doorbell rang, interrupting his private concert. Through the intercom, he heard the voice of Ralph Sharon, his longtime pianist and musical director, who had stuck with him through the lean years when other musicians had moved on to more commercially viable projects. "Come on up, Ralph," Tony called into the speaker, then returned to the piano bench. Ralph Sharon entered the apartment carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing the same patient smile he'd worn through countless rehearsals over the past 2 decades. He was a slight man with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, someone who understood both the technical demands of jazz piano and the emotional requirements of Tony's particular style of storytelling through song. "You sounded good from the hallway," Ralph said, settling onto the bench beside Tony. "Like the old days." "Feels like the old days too," Tony replied, his fingers still moving across the keys. "Danny's got some interesting ideas about where we go from here." Ralph opened his briefcase and pulled out several sheets of music. Some of them yellowed with age, others crisp and new. "He called me last night. Said we're going back to recording the standards, but with a twist. He wants to target the college crowd." Tony paused his playing and looked at his friend with raised eyebrows. "College kids listening to Gershwin and Porter." Danny's optimistic. "Maybe not as crazy as it sounds," Ralph said, spreading the sheet music across the piano's music stand. "I've been reading about this thing happening in the clubs downtown. Young people are getting tired of synthesizers and drum machines. They want to hear real instruments, real voices. There's a hunger for authenticity that the record companies are missing." Tony stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street below where early morning joggers were making their way through Central Park. The city was waking up, the same city that had shaped him as a young man, where he'd learned to sing on street corners and in small clubs, developing the intimate connection with his audience that had defined his career. "You know what I realized during those years in Vegas?" Tony said, still gazing out the window. "I was trying so hard to be someone else that I forgot who I was in the first place. Every time I got on stage and tried to sing those contemporary songs, I felt like I was lying, not just to the audience, but to myself." Ralph began playing a gentle rendition of "Fly Me to the Moon," letting the familiar melody fill the space between them. "The question is, are you ready to be yourself again? Really be yourself? Not just when it's convenient or commercially viable." Tony turned from the window, and Ralph could see something in his expression that had been missing for years, the spark of an artist who had rediscovered his purpose. "More ready than I've been in 20 years. The next few hours were spent going through songs, some that Tony had performed countless times and others that he'd always wanted to record but had never found the right moment or context. They worked through arrangements, discussing tempos and key changes, but more importantly, they talked about the emotional core of each song. "This isn't just about nostalgia," Tony said as they worked through a particularly complex passage of "I've Got the World on a String." These songs have something to say about the human experience that's just as relevant now as it was when they were written. Maybe more relevant. Ralph nodded, his fingers finding the chord progressions that would support Tony's voice without overwhelming it. "The best standards are like great literature. They don't age because they're about universal truths. Love, loss, hope, disappointment. The packaging might change, but the content remains eternal." As the afternoon wore on, Tony Bennett arrived with a stack of papers and the kind of focused energy that reminded Tony of his younger self. Danny had inherited his father's intense work ethic, but he combined it with a shrewd understanding of the music business that Tony had never quite mastered. "I've been talking to people," Danny said, settling into one of the apartment's comfortable chairs. "There's real interest in what we're planning, not from the major labels necessarily, but from smaller companies that understand the market we're going after." "And what market is that exactly?" Tony asked, genuinely curious about his son's vision. Danny leaned forward, his eyes bright with possibilities. "Young adults who've grown up with MTV, but are starting to realize that style without substance gets boring. College students who are studying jazz and discovering these songs for the first time. Baby boomers who remember when you first sang these songs, but are ready to hear them with more mature ears." Ralph continued playing softly in the background, providing a musical soundtrack to their business discussion. "It's ambitious," he said, "but if anyone can make it work, it's Tony." "The key is authenticity," Danny continued. "No trying to modernize the arrangements, no electric guitars or synthesizers. Just you, Ralph, maybe a small combo, and the songs exactly as they were meant to be heard." Tony walked back to the piano and began singing along with Ralph's playing, his voice finding the groove that had made him famous decades earlier. But there was something different now, a depth that hadn't been there in his younger years. The voice was older, certainly, with a gravelly quality that spoke of decades of hard living and hard-won wisdom, but it carried an emotional weight that made every word more meaningful. "You know what I want to do?" Tony said, stopping mid-song. "I want to record an album of duets. Not with other pop singers trying to sound like me, but with young artists who bring their own interpretation to these songs. Danny's eyes lit up. That's brilliant. It positions you as a bridge between generations, someone who can introduce classic material to new audiences while showing that good music transcends age and genre. Ralph played a few bars of "The Lady is a Tramp," and Tony began singing with renewed vigor. The three of them spent the rest of the afternoon planning what would become the foundation of Tony's remarkable comeback. But none of them could have predicted just how dramatically their lives were about to change. As evening approached and the light began to fade from the apartment windows, Tony felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine optimism about his future. The wilderness years were ending, and he was ready to show the world that authentic artistry never truly goes out of style. The MTV studios in Los Angeles buzzed with the controlled chaos that had become synonymous with the music television revolution. Camera operators adjusted their equipment while sound technicians checked levels, and in the middle of it all, Tony Bennett stood adjusting his tie and wondering how he'd ended up here. "Mr. Bennett, we'll be ready for you in about 5 minutes," called out a young production assistant with spiky hair and wearing a Madonna t-shirt. The incongruity of the moment wasn't lost on Tony. Here he was, a 63-year-old traditional pop singer, about to perform on a network that had been built around videos of young rock stars and dance pop artists. Danny Bennett stood nearby, talking animatedly with the show's producer. Tony's son had orchestrated this appearance as part of a carefully planned campaign to introduce his father to a new generation of music fans. The strategy was working better than anyone had dared to hope. "Dad," Danny called over, "they want you to do Steppin' Out with My Baby first. Then maybe I Left My Heart in San Francisco if there's time." Tony nodded, running through the songs in his head. Ralph Sharon was at the piano, warming up with some gentle runs and chord progressions, his fingers as nimble as ever, despite his advancing years. The small combo they'd assembled for the performance, bass, drums, and trumpet, were all young musicians who'd grown up listening to hip-hop and new wave, but had fallen in love with jazz standards through their formal training. "Place is everyone," the director, a woman in her 30s wearing jeans and a blazer, called out to the assembled crew. "This is MTV Unplugged. So remember, we want it intimate, acoustic, natural. Mr. Bennett, just pretend the cameras aren't here and sing like you're in a small club." Tony smiled. "That I can do." As the opening notes of "Steppin' Out with My Baby" filled the studio, something magical began to happen. The song, written by Irving Berlin in 1948, suddenly felt fresh and contemporary in a way that had nothing to do with modern arrangements or updated lyrics. Tony's voice, weathered by decades of performance but still strong and expressive, found every nuance in Berlin's melody and lyrics. The studio audience, mostly young people who had won tickets through MTV contests, began swaying to the rhythm. Many of them had never heard the song before, but they were responding to something deeper than familiarity. They were experiencing the power of genuine artistry meeting timeless material. As Tony reached the bridge of the song, his eyes found a young woman in the front row who was singing along, tears streaming down her face. Later, he would learn that she was a music student at UCLA who had discovered his recordings in her grandfather's collection and had been hoping for years to see him perform live. "Can't you see I'm all dressed up to have a wonderful time?" Tony sang, and the words seemed to capture something essential about the moment. This was pure joy, the celebration of music for its own sake, without the calculations and market research that had dominated the industry for the past decade. When the song ended, the applause was genuine and enthusiastic. The MTV audience, accustomed to polite appreciation for artists they'd been told were important, was responding with the kind of organic excitement that couldn't be manufactured or focus grouped. "Wow," said the director during a brief break. "That was incredible. The energy in here is electric." Tony wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, feeling more energized than he had in years. When the audience is with you like that, you could sing the phone book and make it sound good. Ralph began the opening notes of I left my heart in San Francisco. And Tony prepared for what had been his signature song for nearly 3 decades. He'd sung it thousands of times in thousands of venues, but tonight it felt like he was discovering it for the first time. "The loveliness of Paris seems somehow sadly gay," he began, his voice carrying the melancholy that made the song's eventual joy so powerful. The young faces in the audience were transfixed, many hearing the song for the first time but understanding instinctively why it had become a standard. During the instrumental break, Tony looked around the studio and marveled at the journey that had brought him here. From the streets of Queens to the nightclubs of Manhattan, from the heights of 1950s fame to the wilderness years of trying to stay relevant, and now to this moment of rediscovery and renaissance. As he reached the climactic final verse, "When I come home to you, San Francisco, your golden sun will shine for me," the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. The song built to its triumphant conclusion, and when the last note faded, the audience erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. After the taping, Tony was surrounded by young fans asking for autographs and wanting to know where they could buy his recordings. One young man, probably no more than 20, approached him with a worn copy of The Beat of My Heart album from 1957. "Mr. Bennett," the young man said, his voice nervous but determined, "I've been listening to your music since I was in high school. My jazz teacher told us that if we wanted to understand how to interpret a song, we should listen to you sing it." Tony signed the album and looked the young man in the eye. "Keep listening to all kinds of music," he said. "The great songs will find you if you're open to them." Later that evening, Tony Bennett sat in his hotel room making phone calls to record executives and booking agents. The MTV appearance had exceeded all their expectations, and suddenly Tony Bennett was no longer a nostalgia act. He was a contemporary artist with something relevant to say to modern audiences. "The phones have been ringing all afternoon," Danny told his father over dinner at a quiet restaurant in Beverly Hills. "There are 3 major labels interested in a recording contract, and the booking requests are pouring in. But more importantly, the demographics are incredible. We're not just reaching the older crowd. 40% of the people calling in are under 30. Tony cut into his veal and considered the implications. "It's not about age," he said finally. "Good music is good music. When I was coming up, the audience for jazz and pop standards included young people because that was the contemporary music. Maybe we're finally getting back to a place where quality matters more than demographics." Ralph Sharon, who had joined them for dinner, raised his wineglass. "To the comeback kid," he said with a smile. Tony laughed and raised his own glass. "To good songs and the people who keep them alive." As they sat in the restaurant, none of them could have predicted that this moment would mark the beginning of one of the most remarkable second acts in American entertainment history. The MTV appearance would lead to a recording contract with Columbia Records, the same label that had dropped him 15 years earlier. More importantly, it would establish Tony Bennett as an artist who transcended generational boundaries, someone who could introduce classic American music to new audiences while never compromising his artistic integrity. The wilderness years were officially over, and the legend was just beginning. The ornate ceiling of Chicago Symphony Hall stretched high above the assembled crowd, its gold leaf details catching the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers. Tony Bennett stood in the wings, straightening his tuxedo jacket and listening to the murmur of the audience settling into their seats. At 67, he had performed in hundreds of venues across 6 decades, but tonight felt different. Tonight carried the weight of a career reborn. 5 minutes, the Ambassador East Hotel's Empire Room hummed with the kind of energy that only came when Chicago's elite gathered for an evening of entertainment. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in white linen, where businessmen loosened their ties and socialites sipped champagne from flutes that caught the light like tiny prisms. The room carried the weight of history. Everyone from Ella Fitzgerald to Frank Sinatra had graced this stage, and tonight Tony Bennett was adding his voice to that legacy. At 65, Bennett had clawed his way back from the brink. The cocaine years were behind him. The financial ruin was slowly being repaired, and his voice, that miraculous instrument that had nearly been silenced by his own demons, was stronger than ever. He stood in the wings, adjusting his bow tie with hands that no longer shook from withdrawal. The familiar pre-show ritual centered him, a quiet prayer, a moment to think of his mother, and then the transformation from Anthony Dominic Benedetto to Tony Bennett. 5 minutes, Mr. Bennett, the stage manager whispered, and Tony nodded, feeling the old thrill course through his veins. This was what he lived for. The moment when the spotlight found him and everything else fell away. The audience settled as the lights dimmed, conversations fading to an expectant murmur. Bennett walked onto the stage to warm applause, his presence commanding immediate attention. He'd learned over the decades that the first few seconds were crucial. The audience needed to see confidence, authority, the promise of something magical. "Good evening, Chicago," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying that distinctive warmth that had made him famous. "It's always a pleasure to be back in your beautiful city." The response was enthusiastic, and he smiled, feeling the connection spark between performer and audience. He opened with "The Way You Look Tonight," his voice wrapping around the familiar melody like an old friend returning home. The years of struggle had added depth to his interpretation, each note carrying the weight of experience. The audience was with him from the first phrase, and he could feel their attention like a physical presence. Halfway through his second song, "I Left My Heart in San Francisco," Bennett noticed movement in the audience. Near the back of the room, a young man, barely 18, wearing clothes that had seen better days, was standing by his table, swaying slightly to the music. The kid's face was lit with pure joy, his lips moving as he silently sang along to every word. Bennett's professional instincts kicked in as he observed the scene unfolding. The boy's companions, 3 or 4 other young men dressed in expensive suits, were snickering and pointing. Their body language spoke of privilege and cruelty, the kind of casual meanness that Bennett remembered all too well from his own youth in Queens. As Bennett reached the climactic moment of San Francisco, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. The boy, caught up in the music's emotion, began to sing aloud, quietly at first, then with growing confidence. His voice was untrained but pure, carrying the kind of raw emotion that couldn't be taught in any conservatory. "I left my heart in San Francisco," the boy sang, his voice cracking slightly on the high note, but pushing through with determination. "High on a hill, it calls to me." The reaction was immediate and brutal. Laughter erupted from his table, cutting through the reverent atmosphere like a knife. "Sit down, you embarrassment," one of his companions hissed, loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. "You think you're Tony Bennett?" "More like Tony Baloney," another added, and their laughter grew louder, more cruel. Other patrons began to turn, some shaking their heads in annoyance, others looking embarrassed by the disruption. Bennett watched the boy's face crumble, the joy draining from his features like water from a broken glass. The young man's shoulders sagged as he sat down heavily, his head bowed in shame. The moment felt familiar to Bennett in a way that made his chest tight. He'd been that boy once, performing on street corners while better-dressed kids mocked his dreams. The song was supposed to continue. The show was supposed to go on. But something in Bennett rebelled against that expectation. He held the final note of San Francisco longer than usual, his eyes never leaving the young man in the back. The room fell completely silent as Bennett lowered the microphone and took a step forward on the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "I've been performing for over 40 years, and in that time, I've learned something important about music. It doesn't belong to any one person. It belongs to everyone who feels it in their heart." A murmur rippled through the audience. This wasn't part of the usual show format, and people sensed something significant was happening. Bennett's eyes found the young man again. "I heard a voice back there that reminded me why I fell in love with singing in the first place. Pure, honest, unafraid." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Son, would you mind standing up?" The boy looked around desperately, clearly wanting to disappear. His tormentors were staring at him with expressions that ranged from amused to mortified. But Bennett's gaze was patient, encouraging, and slowly the young man rose to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment and uncertainty. "What's your name?" Bennett asked, his voice gentle but carrying clearly through the now silent room. Marcus," the boy stammered, his voice barely audible. "Marcus," Bennett repeated, smiling. "That's a strong name. Marcus, I want to tell you something, and I want everyone in this room to hear it too." The atmosphere in the Empire Room had shifted completely. What had begun as an evening of polished entertainment had become something else entirely, a moment of raw human connection that none of the patrons would ever forget. Bennett moved to the edge of the stage, eliminating as much distance as possible between himself and Marcus. The young man stood frozen, caught between the desire to run and the magnetic pull of the moment. The room held its breath, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Marcus," Bennett began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of commanding stages, "I want to tell you about a boy I once knew. He was about your age, maybe a little younger. His father had died when he was 10, leaving his family in poverty in Queens, New York. This boy used to sing on street corners, hoping someone would drop a few coins in his hat so he could help his mother pay the rent." The audience was completely still now, hanging on every word. Even Marcus's cruel companions had stopped their snickering, perhaps beginning to understand that they were witnessing something significant. "The other kids in his neighborhood used to mock him too," Bennett continued, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "They called him crazy for thinking he could make it as a singer. 'Who do you think you are, Bing Crosby?' they'd say. They threw things at him sometimes, told him to get a real job, to stop embarrassing himself and his family." Bennett walked slowly across the stage, his movement measured and deliberate. That boy could have given up. God knows he wanted to some nights when he came home with empty pockets and a bruised spirit. But something inside him wouldn't let him quit. "You know why?" Marcus shook his head slightly, still too overwhelmed to speak. "Because the music was true," Bennett said simply. "And when something is true, Marcus, it doesn't matter if you're wearing a tuxedo or clothes from the Salvation Army. It doesn't matter if you've had voice lessons or if you learned by singing along to the radio. Truth is truth, and music knows the difference." The silence in the room was so complete that the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Bennett had transformed what should have been a humiliating moment into something profound, and everyone present could feel the shift. "I want to ask you something, Marcus," Bennett said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "When you were singing along to my song just now, how did it make you feel?" Marcus looked around the room, his eyes catching the faces of people who had gone from amused spectators to engaged witnesses. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence, everyone heard him clearly. Like I belonged somewhere," he said, the words seeming to surprise him as much as anyone else. "Like the music was bigger than everything else. Bigger than—" He glanced at his companions, then back to Bennett. "Bigger than what people think about me." Bennett smiled, and it was the kind of smile that carried decades of understanding. "That's exactly right, son. That's exactly what music is supposed to do." He turned to address the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've performed in the greatest venues in the world. Carnegie Hall, the London Palladium, the Copacabana, when it was the most famous nightclub in America. I've sung for presidents and kings, for crowds of 50,000 and intimate gatherings like this one." His voice grew stronger, more passionate. "But I want you to understand something. Music isn't about the venue. It's not about the clothes or the credentials or who your friends are. Music is about the human spirit finding its voice. And tonight, I heard that voice from the back of this room. Marcus was crying now, tears streaming down his face, but he remained standing. The transformation in his posture was remarkable. His shoulders had straightened, his head was up, and there was something different in his eyes. Bennett looked directly at Marcus's companions, and his expression hardened slightly. I don't know what brought you gentlemen here tonight, but I hope you'll remember this moment. The young man you were mocking has something that can't be bought or inherited. He has music in his soul. That's rarer and more valuable than anything you'll find in your trust funds. One of the young men, the one who had been most vocal in his mockery, looked down at his hands, his face flushed with shame. The others seemed equally uncomfortable. The casual cruelty they displayed now exposed under Bennett's gentle but firm rebuke. "Marcus," Bennett said, bringing his attention back to the young man, "I want to make you a promise. If you keep singing, if you honor that gift inside you, the music will take care of you. It might not be easy, and it might not happen quickly, but authentic voices eventually find their way to the light." He paused, then made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "In fact, I'd like you to sing with me right now. Would you do that?" The room erupted in murmurs. This was unprecedented. Tony Bennett didn't pull audience members on stage for impromptu duets. But Marcus was already shaking his head, overwhelmed by the offer. I can't. I don't know how to. I'm not," he stammered. "Son," Bennett said gently, "you've already been singing. I just want the whole room to hear what I heard. Trust me." Marcus looked around the room one more time, his gaze lingering on his companions, who now seemed like strangers. Something shifted in his expression, a moment of decision that would define the rest of his life. "Okay," he said, his voice stronger now. "Okay, I'll try." The audience watched in fascination as Marcus began to make his way toward the stage, weaving between tables filled with people who had gone from idle spectators to invested witnesses in the span of 15 minutes. Bennett waited patiently, his smile never wavering, as the young man climbed the steps and stood beside him under the bright lights. Standing under the stage lights, Marcus felt exposed in a way he'd never experienced. The audience stretched before him like an ocean of expectant faces, and for a moment his courage nearly failed him. Bennett sensed his hesitation and moved closer, his presence both calming and reassuring. "What's your favorite song of mine?" Bennett asked quietly, positioning himself so he could speak directly to Marcus without the microphone picking up their conversation. "The Way You Look Tonight," Marcus replied without hesitation. "My grandmother used to sing it while she cooked. She said it reminded her of my grandfather when they were young." Bennett's smile deepened. "A good choice. That song has saved me more times than I can count." He gestured to the piano player, a seasoned musician named Jerry, who had worked with Bennett for years. "Jerry, let's do The Way You Look Tonight. Nice and easy." As the familiar opening chords filled the room, Bennett turned to Marcus. "Just follow my lead. Don't think about anyone else in the room. Just think about your grandmother, about why this song mattered to her. Let that guide you." The introduction played, and Bennett began to sing, his voice wrapping around the melody with the effortless grace that had made him a legend. "Someday, when I'm awfully low, when the world is cold." Marcus listened, feeling the familiar words wash over him, remembering countless evenings in his grandmother's small kitchen, the smell of her cooking mingling with her soft, slightly off-key voice. When Bennett reached the end of the first verse, he looked at Marcus and nodded. This was his moment. Marcus opened his mouth and let the words flow. "With each word, your tenderness grows, tearing my fears apart." His voice was different from Bennett's, younger, rawer, carrying the slight roughness that came from years of singing without formal training. But there was something achingly beautiful about it, a vulnerability that cut through all pretense and reached directly into the hearts of everyone listening. The two voices found each other on the chorus, Bennett's seasoned instrument providing a foundation for Marcus's soaring, emotional delivery. "The Way You Look Tonight," they sang together, And the harmony that emerged was unexpected and magical, not perfect in a technical sense, but perfect in its authenticity. Marcus gained confidence as the song progressed, his voice growing stronger, more secure. He wasn't trying to imitate Bennett or sound like a professional singer. He was simply letting the music flow through him, the way it had in his grandmother's kitchen, the way it did when he sang alone in his small room, dreaming of something larger than his circumstances. The audience was transfixed. What they were witnessing wasn't a polished performance. It was something rarer, a moment of pure musical truth. Several people in the crowd were crying, moved by the raw emotion in Marcus's voice and the generosity Bennett was showing by sharing his stage. As they reached the final verse, something beautiful happened. Marcus took the lead, his voice soaring on the line, "Just the way you look tonight," while Bennett provided harmony, the master supporting the student, the legend making space for a new voice to shine. When the song ended, the silence lasted for several heartbeats. Then the applause began, tentative at first, then growing into something thunderous and sustained. People rose from their tables, giving both singers a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Marcus stood frozen, overwhelmed by the response. Tears were streaming down his face, but he was smiling too, an expression